In the scorching summer of 1882, a grieving Wyoming rancher named Samuel Morrison stood in a dusty courthouse square and made a choice. It was a choice that would cost him everything he had left: his land, his future, his last dollar. But he wasn't just bidding on a piece of property. He was bidding on a person. No, not one person. He was bidding on six of them. A widow and her five children being sold like cattle to the highest bidder. Samuel thought he was doing a good deed, preventing a family from being torn apart. He had no idea he was stepping into the middle of a war he was not prepared to fight. And he had no idea that the woman he just bought held a secret that could either save his entire territory or get them all killed. The crack of the auctioneer's gavel sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive heat. It was July 15th, 1882 in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and the sun was a merciless hammer beating down on the desperate. Samuel Morrison could feel the sweat trickle down his back, plastering his worn shirt to his skin. In his pocket, his fingers traced the edges of his last $137. It was mortgage money. Money that was supposed to buy him one more month on the ranch his father had built. The ranch where he'd buried his wife just 4 months ago. Around him the crowd was a pack of vultures, their eyes hungry, their faces grim. This was where dreams came to die. Foreclosures, bankruptcies, lives sold off piece by piece. The air smelled of dust, horse manure, and quiet desperation. Samuel's stomach growled, a hollow reminder that he'd skipped breakfast again. Margaret would have fussed over him, pressing a warm biscuit into his hand. But Margaret was gone. The fever had taken her, and with her, it had taken the light from Samuel's world. The ranch house was no longer a home. It was a tomb, echoing with silence and memories. Some days the thought of joining her was a sweet, dangerous whisper in the back of his mind. Next up, the Baxter family's prize bull, the auctioneer bellowed, a wiry man named Hayes with a voice like a rusted hinge. Fine breeding stock, gentlemen. We'll start the bidding at $20. Samuel barely heard him. His gaze drifted past the bull, past the eager bidders, to a commotion near the courthouse steps. A woman stood there straight and proud in a faded blue dress. She was surrounded by 5 children, who huddled close to her like chicks seeking shelter from a hawk. The oldest was a girl, maybe 14, with serious eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world. 2 boys, twins by the look of them, stood like little soldiers at her side. A younger girl with hair the color of corn silk peeked out from behind the woman's skirts, and in her arms a baby fussed in the stifling heat. That's the Hartwell bunch, a voice next to him rasped. It was old Pete Jenkins, the general store owner. Heard their pa, Thomas, died owing the bank near $200. Poor souls got nothing left. Nowhere to go. Samuel looked closer. The woman, Mary Hartwell, couldn't be much older than 30. Her dress was patched but clean. The children were thin, but their clothes were neat. There was a dignity about them, a refusal to be broken that tugged at something deep inside him. It reminded him of Margaret. The auctioneer's voice boomed again, and this time, the words turned Samuel's blood to ice. Ladies and gentlemen, we now come to the final item of today's proceedings. Due to the outstanding debts of the deceased Thomas Hartwell, we have for auction the remaining family members. A sick, uncomfortable murmur rippled through the crowd. Samuel's hands balled into fists. He'd heard of this barbaric practice, where a family's debt could turn them into indentured servants, sold off to work until the money was repaid. But to see a mother and her children standing on a block like livestock, it was an offense against God and man. Now this here's a complete family unit, Hayes shouted, his tone no different than when he'd been selling the bull. 1 widow capable of household management and teaching, 4 children old enough for light work, and 1 infant. A bargain, folks. We'll start the bidding at $50 for the entire lot. Silence. A heavy, shameful silence hung over the square. People shuffled their feet, looked away, anywhere but at the family on the steps. And that's when a voice, rough and cruel, cut through the tension. $50. Samuel's head snapped around. It was Jake Slanton, a rancher known for his short temper and his heavy hand. Mary Hartwell's face went white, but she didn't flinch. The oldest girl, Rebecca, put a protective arm around her brothers. The monster who just bit on her family was one step closer to owning them. 60, another voice shouted. Samuel's jaw tightened. Jeremiah Cobb, the richest, most powerful rancher in the territory. A man whose ambition was matched only by his cruelty. Stories about Cobb were whispered in saloons and general stores. Stories of workers who were little more than slaves, of families who went to work on his spread and were never the same. Cobb wanted them. And what Jeremiah Cobb wanted, he usually got. The baby in Mary's arms began to wail, its cries a thin, heartbreaking sound in the tense air. Mary rocked him gently, her movements calm and measured, but Samuel could see the terror in her eyes. $75, Cobb called, his voice dripping with arrogant confidence. He looked around the crowd, a smirk playing on his lips, daring anyone to challenge him. The auctioneer raised his hammer. 75 going once. Samuel's heart pounded like a drum against his ribs. His own troubles, the mortgage, the loneliness, they felt insignificant now. He thought of Margaret, her unwavering belief that good people had a duty to stand against the darkness. He thought of his empty house, the silence that screamed at him day and night. He thought of the $137 in his pocket. It wasn't enough to save his ranch. It was a fool's hope. But maybe, just maybe, it was enough to save someone else. 75 going twice. The world seemed to slow down. The faces in the crowd, the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams, the tear tracking its way down the little blonde girl's cheek. His brain screamed at him to stay quiet, to walk away, to save himself. But his heart, the part of him that still remembered Margaret's goodness, wouldn't let him. Before he even knew what he was doing, his hand shot into the air. $100! The words ripped from his throat, raw and cracked. A collective gasp swept through the courthouse square. Every single head swiveled in his direction. Samuel felt the weight of their stares, 100 pairs of eyes burning into him, a mixture of shock, pity, and disbelief. Jeremiah Cobb's cold, pale eyes locked onto his from across the yard. The smirk was gone, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. 110, Cobb said, his voice flat, dismissing Samuel as a minor irritation. Samuel's mouth was as dry as the dust under his boots. He had $137 to his name. This was a fool's errand. He couldn't win. But then he looked at Mary Hartwell. She was looking right at him, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of something in her gaze. It wasn't hope. It was something fiercer. It was the desperate courage of a she-bear defending her cubs. The teenage girl, Rebecca, whispered something to her mother, her young face a mask of fierce determination. The twin boys stood stock still, their eyes wide. 120, Samuel yelled, the number tasting like recklessness on his tongue. A low murmur went through the crowd. People were starting to take notice. This wasn't just an auction anymore. It was a showdown. Cobb's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a down-on-his-luck rancher he could buy and sell a dozen times over. The challenge wasn't about the money. It was about the public display of defiance. It was about pride. 130, Cobb bit out, the words sharp as broken glass. Samuel's heart sank. He was at his limit. He had $7 left. He had failed. He had given them a moment of hope only to have it snatched away. He hung his head, the defeat a bitter poison in his gut. And that's when the impossible happened. A hand landed on his shoulder. Sam, a quiet voice said. It was Pete Jenkins. The old store owner pressed a crumpled $20 bill into Samuel's hand. You're doing the right thing, son. Before Samuel could even process it, another voice spoke up from behind him. Make that 40. It was Doc Williams, the territory's physician. You never did let me pay you for that beef you brought us during the fever. Call it even. Then another voice. Got 10 here, Sam? And another. Here's 5. It's all I've got, but it's yours. In a matter of moments, a river of crumpled bills and coins flowed into his hands. Neighbors, acquaintances, people he barely knew, were stepping forward, their faces set with a shared purpose. They weren't just giving him money, they were giving him ammunition. They were choosing a side, and they had chosen his. Samuel looked up, his vision blurred with sudden emotion. He saw a community that had been pushed around by Jeremiah Cobb for too long, a community that had finally found a champion in the most unlikely of men. He turned back to the auction block, his spine straight, his voice ringing with the strength of 20 people. $160. Cobb's face was now a dangerous shade of red. He glared around the square, his eyes promising retribution to the traitors who had dared to defy him. But the tide had turned. He was no longer a powerful man bidding on property. He was a bully facing down an entire town. He hesitated. For the first time all day, Jeremiah Cobb hesitated. $200, Samuel shouted, the number a declaration of war. A gasp went through the crowd. $200 was a fortune. It was more than most of them would see in a year. Cobb stood frozen, the gears turning behind his cold eyes. He was calculating, weighing his pride against the cost, weighing the satisfaction of crushing this rebellion against the public humiliation of a protracted bidding war he might not even win. He looked at Mary Hartwell, at her 5 children, and then back at Samuel, his face a mask of pure hatred. "Going once," the auctioneer cried, his voice trembling slightly. Cobb opened his mouth, then snapped it shut. "Going twice." The silence was deafening. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath. "Sold!" The gavel came down with a thunderous crack. "To Samuel Morrison for $200. A roar erupted from the crowd. Cheers, applause, whistles. It was a victory. But as Samuel stood there, the community's money clutched in his hand, a cold wave of reality washed over him. He had just spent his last dime, and the money of his friends, to buy 6 human beings. He had saved them from Jeremiah Cobb. But what in God's name was he going to do with them now? Mary Hartwell walked toward him, her children trailing behind her like a small, bewildered parade. She stopped in front of him, her head held high. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice a low, steady whisper that cut through the noise of the celebration. "I don't know what you expect from us, but I need you to know something. We are not charity. We are not broken. We will work for our keep." Samuel looked into her eyes, brown with flecks of gold, and saw a strength that humbled him. He saw a woman who had been to hell and back and was still standing. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice hoarse, "I expect you to make yourselves at home. After that, I reckon we'll figure it out as we go." The journey to the ranch was 8 miles of dusty, silent tension. Mary sat beside him on the wagon bench, the baby in her lap, while Samuel tried not to think about the fact that he was now responsible for 6 extra mouths and had exactly $2 to his name. Little Emma, the blonde girl, sat between them, her blue eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. In the back, Rebecca kept watch over the twins, Joshua and Jacob, her expression unreadable. The ranch, when it finally came into view, looked small and worn down. The house needed a new coat of paint, and the barn roof sagged in the middle. It wasn't much, but it was his. "It needs some work," Samuel said, the words an apology. He suddenly felt ashamed of the state of his life, of the home he had let slide into disrepair since Margaret's death. But from the back of the wagon, Rebecca's clear voice rang out. "It looks like a real home." As they pulled into the yard, Samuel's old dog, Rex, came bounding out, barking a joyous welcome. The sound of it, followed by Emma's delighted squeal, was the first truly happy noise Samuel had heard on his property in months. The house, which had felt so cavernously empty, was suddenly filled with the rustle and chatter of life. It was overwhelming. That night, Samuel sat at his own kitchen table and felt like a stranger. Rebecca and Mary moved around the stove with an easy, practiced grace, turning his meager supplies of beans and cornbread into a real meal. The twins were exploring every nook and cranny, their whispers echoing through the rooms, while Emma had appointed herself Rex's new best friend. Samuel had given Mary and the girls the main bedroom, his and Margaret's room, and had taken the small cot off the kitchen for himself. It felt right, but it also felt like another piece of his old life had been stripped away. After the children were asleep, Mary found him on the front porch, staring out at the vast, star-dusted darkness. The night was alive with the sound of crickets and the gentle murmur of the nearby creek. "Mr. Morrison," she began, her voice soft in the cool air, "we will not be a burden. Rebecca is a wonder with numbers. The boys are strong. I am a hard worker. We will earn our keep. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The loneliness he had lived with for months was still there, a dull ache in his chest. But it was different now. It was a shared loneliness. There's something else, Mary said, her tone shifting. It was the same tone she'd used at the auction house, the one that said she was about to take control. I saw your account books on the desk. You're about to lose this ranch. Samuel stiffened. Those are my private papers, ma'am. And this is my family's future, sir, she countered, her voice firm but not unkind. You spent the money that was supposed to save this place on us. That makes your finances my business now. He was about to argue to tell her she was overstepping, but she pressed on, her words sharp and precise. You're running this ranch with your heart, not your head. Your cattle operation is losing money. Your wheat crop is profitable, but you treat it like a hobby. You have land by the creek that's perfect for a vegetable garden, and fresh vegetables sell for a premium in Cheyenne. Samuel stared at her, stunned into silence. In a few hours, this woman had seen the cracks in his life's work, cracks he himself had been too grief-stricken to notice. How do you know all this? I was a school teacher, she said, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. And I was married to a businessman who made a lot of mistakes. I learned to pay attention. I learned to see what other people miss. She paused, turning to face him directly, her silhouette framed by the moonlight. Mr. Morrison, saving this ranch isn't about working harder. It's about working smarter. And it's about making alliances. Now tell me everything you know about Jeremiah Cobb's business. The question was so unexpected it felt like a slap. What does Cobb have to do with this? Mary's voice dropped to a near whisper, a conspiratorial tone that made the hairs on Samuel's arm stand up. Because my husband, Thomas, wasn't just in debt to the bank. He was in debt to Jeremiah Cobb. And he wasn't the only one. Cobb is a predator. He preys on ranchers like you. He finds their weakness, and he squeezes until they break. A cold dread started to seep into Samuel's bones. He hadn't just outbid a rival at an auction. He had publicly humiliated a dangerous man, and in the process taken something that man believed was his. What did your husband know? He asked, his voice low. Mary looked out into the darkness, as if she could see ghosts dancing in the sagebrush. Thomas kept records, she said softly. Detailed records of every crooked deal, every threat, every life Jeremiah Cobb has destroyed on his way to the top. I have those records, and I believe that's the real reason Cobb wanted us. It wasn't for our labor, it was for our silence. Samuel felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He had stumbled into something far bigger and more dangerous than a simple property dispute. This wasn't about a ranch anymore. This was about survival, and he had just painted a target on the backs of 7 people, himself included. The family he had bought for $200 had come with a price he hadn't seen on the auction notice. They had come with an enemy, and that enemy was now coming for them all. The next morning, the ranch was a hive of activity. Before the sun had even crested the horizon, Mary had a plan laid out on the kitchen table, written in neat, precise script on the back of old feed receipts. It was a battle plan. She had the twins, Joshua and Jacob, clearing the fertile ground by the creek for a vegetable garden. She tasked Rebecca with a complete audit of Samuel's chaotic account books, her sharp mind for numbers quickly untangling years of disorganized records. Even little Emma was given a job, collecting eggs from the chicken coop, a task she performed with solemn importance. Samuel watched half in awe and half in terror. This woman, who had been sold on an auction block less than 48 hours ago, was now commanding his life with the quiet efficiency of a 5-star general. Your profit margin on cattle is less than 20% after expenses, Rebecca announced from the table, not even looking up from her ledger. But the wheat fields, if we were to expand them to the south pasture, could yield a profit closer to 40%. And if we sell fresh vegetables and eggs in town twice a week, Mary added, bouncing baby Christopher on her hip, we could generate enough cash flow to cover your monthly expenses and start paying back the neighbors who helped us. It was brilliant, it was methodical, and it was their only shot. But as Samuel hammered fence posts with the boys, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The vast, empty prairie didn't feel empty anymore. He kept glancing toward the low hills to the east, toward Cobb's sprawling territory, expecting to see a rider silhouetted against the sky. The first warning came 3 days later. Samuel rode out to check on his cattle and found a section of his fence cut. Not broken, cut, cleanly, with wire snips. His herd had wandered out onto the open range, and it took him the better part of the day to round them up. It was a message, a quiet, menacing reminder that they were not safe. When he told Mary, she simply nodded, her lips pressed into a thin, determined line. "It started," she said. That night she revealed her secret. She led him to the back of the wagon, where her family's few belongings were stored. From a false bottom and an old wooden trunk, she pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. "Thomas's record," she whispered, her hand resting on the cover as if it were a holy book. "Everything is in here. Coded, of course. He was a careful man." They spent hours by candlelight with Rebecca, whose mind for patterns was sharper than either of theirs, helping them decipher the cryptic entries. It was worse than Samuel had imagined. Cobb wasn't just a ruthless businessman, he was a monster. The ledger detailed a systematic campaign of terror. Ranchers intimidated, water sources poisoned, mysterious fires that conveniently cleared the way for Cobb to buy up land for pennies on the dollar. Thomas Hartwell had been getting close to exposing him, partnering with other ranchers to gather evidence. And then, Thomas had died. A sudden, violent fever, the doctor had said. But now, looking at the entries in the ledger, Samuel had a sickening feeling it wasn't a fever that had killed Mary's husband. It was Jeremiah Cobb. The very next day, a rider appeared on the horizon. It wasn't a sneak attack. It was an announcement. Jeremiah Cobb, flanked by 4 of his toughest ranch hands, rode into Samuel's yard as if he owned the place. Rex went into a frenzy, but Cobb's horse didn't even flinch. Samuel came out onto the porch, his shotgun held loosely in his hands. Mary was right behind him, the children clustered in the doorway behind her. Cobb's cold eyes swept over the scene. The new garden, the organized woodpile, the sense of order that had replaced Samuel's bachelor chaos. His gaze lingered on Mary, a possessive, ugly look that made Samuel's knuckles turn white. "Morrison," Cobb said, his voice a low growl, "you've got something that belongs to me." "This is my property, Cobb," Samuel said, his voice steady. "The family works for me. It's all legal." Cobb let out a short, harsh laugh. "Legal? We're a long way from the law out here, Morrison. I'm not talking about the family. I'm talking about a book. A ledger. I believe Thomas Hartwell left it to his grieving widow." Mary's face was a mask of stone. She didn't move, didn't breathe. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice clear and cold. Cobb's smile was chilling. "Don't play dumb with me, Mrs. Hartwell. I'll make you a one-time offer. Give me the book, and I'll forget this whole business. I'll let you and your brats stay here and play house with this broken-down rancher." Rebecca stepped forward, her chin jutted out defiantly. "We're not his brats," she said, her voice shaking but full of fire. "And we're not afraid of you." Cobb's eyes narrowed, his attention shifting to the 14-year-old girl. The look he gave her was so full of menace that Samuel took a step forward, raising the shotgun. "That's enough, Cobb. State your business or get off my land." Cobb's hand drifted down, resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "My business is my property. Give me the book, Morrison, or I'll take it. And I'll take them, too. Maybe I'll start with the girl. She's got spirit. I like that." The threat hung in the air, vile and suffocating. Samuel's world narrowed to the space between him and Cobb. He could feel Mary's presence behind him, a silent pillar of strength. He could hear the frightened breathing of the children. He had a choice. He could give the man what he wanted, save their lives in the short term, and live as his slave. Or he could fight. "There is no book," Samuel said, his voice like flint. "Now get the hell off my ranch before I put you off it myself." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the wind whispering through the tall grass. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Cobb pulled his horse around. "Wrong answer, Morrison," he snarled. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." As they rode away, Samuel knew this was just the beginning. The fence had been a warning. The visit had been an ultimatum. What came next would be war. That night, as Mary and Samuel sat a silent vigil on the porch, A new, more terrifying thought occurred to him. How did Cobb know for sure that the ledger even existed? Thomas Hartwell had been a careful man. He wouldn't have told anyone, which meant someone else had. Someone must have seen him with it. Someone who was close to him. Someone he trusted. And that's when Mary's composure finally cracked. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. There was someone, she whispered, her voice choked with a dawning horror. Thomas's business partner. The man he was going to bring the evidence to. The man who was supposed to help him take Cobb down. Who? Samuel asked, dread coiling in his stomach. Mary looked at him, her eyes wide with betrayal and fear. The man who runs the general store in town, she said. Pete Jenkins. The man who had started the collection at the auction. The man who had called Samuel a hero. He wasn't a friend. He was a spy, and he had just delivered them all into the hands of a killer. The revelation that Pete Jenkins, the kindly old store owner, was a traitor hit Samuel like a physical blow. It recontextualized everything. The collection at the auction hadn't been an act of community defiance. It had been a performance. Jenkins had wanted Samuel to win, to get the family out to his isolated ranch where Cobb could deal with them quietly, away from the prying eyes of the town. Jenkins had played him. He had played the entire town. A cold, calculated fury began to build in Samuel's chest. He felt like a fool, a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing. Mary, however, was already past the shock. Her mind was racing, connecting the dots. It makes sense, she said, her voice low and grim. Pete controls the flow of information in town. He knows who's in debt, who's struggling. He would have been the perfect man for Cobb to use to identify his next victim. He probably got a cut of every ranch Cobb destroyed. The deception was so deep, so insidious, it was almost brilliant. They were completely isolated. The one man they thought was their staunchest ally was actually their greatest enemy, next to Cobb himself. They couldn't go to the sheriff. Jenkins would hear about it before they even left his store. They couldn't trust anyone. What do we do? Samuel asked, the question hanging heavy in the night air. Mary looked at the ledger, which she now kept on her person at all times, tucked into a hidden pocket in her dress. We fight back, she said, her voice regaining its steel. Cobb and Jenkins think we're trapped. They think we're weak. We have to use that against them. We have to find a way to get this ledger into the hands of someone they can't control. The next few days were a quiet, nerve-wracking hell. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, sounded like an approaching rider. The children, sensing the tension, stayed close to the house, their games hushed and subdued. Samuel and the twins took turns standing watch through the night, their rifles never far from their hands. The psychological warfare escalated. One morning, they woke up to find their well had been fouled, the water tainted with the bloated carcass of a dead coyote. It was a vile, disgusting act, meant to demoralize them, to make their lives unbearable. They were forced to haul water from the creek, a back-breaking task that ate up precious hours of their day. A few days later, half a dozen of Samuel's cattle turned up dead, poisoned. It was a direct attack on their livelihood, a clear message that Cobb could and would destroy everything Samuel had worked for. Samuel was beginning to fray. The constant threat, the lack of sleep, the weight of responsibility were wearing him down. He found himself snapping at the children, his temper short, but Mary was his anchor. When his anger flared, her calmness soothed him. When his hope wavered, her determination bolstered him. They were becoming a team, forged in the crucible of fear and uncertainty. Their strategy was twofold. First, they had to create a decoy. They worked together, with Rebecca's help, to create a second ledger, a fake one filled with plausible but ultimately useless information. The real ledger, Mary wrapped in oilcloth and hid in the one place she believed no one would ever think to look, inside the stuffing of little Emma's favorite rag doll. Second, they needed a way to get the real evidence out. Their only hope was the territorial marshal, a federal lawman who operated out of Denver and was outside of Cobb's sphere of influence. The problem was he was 200 miles away. The plan was desperate. Samuel would ride into Cheyenne pretending to be a broken man. He would go to Pete Jenkins' store and make a show of buying supplies on credit, complaining loudly about his bad luck. the poisoned cattle, the fouled well. The goal was to make Jenkins believe they were on the verge of collapse. While he was in town, Mary and the children would slip away, heading east toward the next town, where she would try to send a telegram to the marshal in Denver. It was a long shot, a dangerous, almost suicidal plan. If Jenkins didn't buy Samuel's act, if Cobb's men were watching the ranch, if the telegraph operator was in Cobb's pocket, any number of things could go wrong. The night before they were set to put their plan into action, a fierce thunderstorm rolled across the prairie. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder cracked like the sky was breaking apart. Inside the small house, the family was gathered around the fire, a rare moment of peace in the midst of the storm. Little Emma was asleep on Mary's lap, her rag doll clutched tight in her arms. The twins were playing a quiet game of checkers. Rebecca was reading, but Samuel could see her eyes darting toward the window with every flash of lightning. Samuel looked at Mary, her face illuminated by the flickering firelight. In just a few short weeks, she had transformed his life. She and her children had filled the empty spaces in his home and his heart. The thought of putting them in such grave danger was a physical pain. "There has to be another way," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Mary looked up, her gaze meeting his. "There isn't," she said softly. "This is our only chance. We have to take it, together." In that moment, looking at this woman and the family he had come to love as his own, Samuel knew he would do anything to protect them. He would walk through fire. He would face down the devil himself. He just prayed it would be enough. As the storm raged outside, a new sound cut through the howl of the wind, a low, rhythmic thudding. It was coming from the front door. Someone was out there, in the middle of the storm. Samuel grabbed his rifle, his heart hammering in his chest. He motioned for Mary to get the children into the back room. He crept to the door, his finger on the trigger, and called out, "Who's there?" A voice answered, weak and strained against the wind. It's the sheriff. Sheriff Bradley. For God's sake, Morrison. Let me in." Samuel hesitated. The sheriff had been useless, cowed by Cobb's power. Was this a trick? But the voice sounded genuinely desperate. He slid the bolt and opened the door a crack. Sheriff Bradley stumbled inside, soaking wet and bleeding from a gash on his forehead. He collapsed onto the floor, his chest heaving. "It's Cobb," he gasped, clutching his side. "He's gone crazy. He knows about the ledger. Jenkins told him everything. He's coming for you. He's coming to burn you out. Tonight." The storm wasn't the only thing breaking tonight. All hell was about to break loose right on their doorstep. Sheriff Bradley's words hung in the air, more terrifying than the thunder crashing outside. "He knows everything," the sheriff repeated, his voice raspy with pain. "Jenkins came to me an hour ago, scared out of his mind. Said Cobb found out you were planning to run. He's not going to let you escape. He's gathered a dozen men. They're riding here to finish this. For good." The betrayal from Jenkins was now complete, but there was no time for anger. There was only time for survival. Samuel's mind raced. A dozen men against one man, one woman, and a wounded sheriff. It was a slaughter waiting to happen. Mary was already in motion. "Rebecca, take the twins and Emma to the storm cellar. Bar the door from the inside, and don't make a sound no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" The girl nodded, her face pale but her eyes resolute. She gathered her siblings, herding them toward the trap door in the kitchen floor like a seasoned shepherdess. Before she descended, she turned back. "Mama, I love you," Mary said, her voice thick with emotion. "Now go." As the cellar door slammed shut, Samuel helped the sheriff into a chair. "What happened to you?" "I tried to stop them," Bradley wheezed. "Tried to reason with Cobb. He laughed in my face. Said the law doesn't run this territory anymore. He does. One of his men pistol-whipped me when I went for my gun." The sheriff, the symbol of order, was broken and bleeding on his floor. They were truly on their own. "There's no escape," Bradley said, his voice full of despair. "They'll surround the house." "Then we don't try to escape," Samuel said, his own voice sounding strangely calm. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "We make our stand here." Mary appeared at his side, holding the shotgun Thomas had taught her to use. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were fearless. "This is our home," she said. "We're not giving it up without a fight." They had minutes, maybe less. Samuel barricaded the front door with a heavy wooden chest. Mary secured the windows, using blankets to block the view and hopefully stop some of the glass from shattering inward. They extinguished the lamps, plunging the house into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the frantic, strobe-like flashes of lightning. "They'll try to burn us out," Samuel said, remembering the sheriff's words. "We need water." They filled every bucket and pot they could find, placing them strategically around the main room. It felt hopelessly inadequate, like trying to fight a forest fire with a teacup. And then, through the storm, they heard it, the thunder of hoofbeats. Dozens of them. They were here. "Get down!" Samuel yelled, pulling Mary behind the relative safety of an overturned table. The first volley of shots ripped through the night. Wood splintered. Glass exploded. Bullets whined through the small house, thudding into the walls with sickening force. Outside, voices yelled, carried on the wind. It was Buck Wheeler, Cobb's sneering right-hand man. "Morrison, we know you're in there, and we know you got the book. Send out the woman with it, and Cobb might let you live." "Go to hell!" Samuel roared back, firing his Winchester through the broken window in the direction of the voice. A scream of pain answered him, followed by a string of curses. He had hit one of them. The fight was on. For the next hour, the small ranch house was a battlefield. Gunfire erupted in terrifying bursts. Cobb's men circled the house, firing from all directions, trying to find a weak spot. Inside, Samuel, Mary, and the wounded sheriff returned fire sparingly, making every shot count, trying to create the illusion that there were more of them inside. Lightning flashed, revealing fleeting glimpses of dark figures moving through the rain. Thunder cracked, masking the sound of their own gunshots. The storm that had seemed like a curse was now their only ally. Then came the smell of smoke, acrid and terrifying. "The porch is on fire!" Mary yelled. One of Cobb's men had managed to get close enough to throw a torch. Flames began to lick up the dry wooden posts, the orange glow visible through the windows. This was the endgame. They were going to be burned alive. While Samuel laid down covering fire, Mary and the sheriff used the buckets of water, desperately trying to douse the flames. But it was a losing battle. The fire was spreading, the smoke filling the room, choking them. They were running out of time. They were running out of air. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the chaos. It was a bugle, a clear, piercing military call that sliced through the noise of the storm and the battle. What in God's name was that? From outside came shouts of confusion and panic from Cobb's men. The gunfire aimed at the house slackened, replaced by a new, more intense firefight happening further out in the yard. Through the smoke, Samuel peered out the window. In the next flash of lightning, he saw them. A dozen uniformed men on horseback, their blue coats dark with rain, their sabers drawn. It was the United States Cavalry. They were charging into the fray, a disciplined, deadly force cutting through Cobb's disorganized thugs. Cobb's men, caught completely by surprise, broke and ran. It was a rout. The battle was over as quickly as it had begun. As the smoke cleared, a cavalry officer, his uniform soaked but his posture ramrod straight, dismounted and strode toward the burning porch. "Samuel Morrison?" he called out. Samuel stumbled outside, his lungs burning, his mind reeling in disbelief. "Yes, Lieutenant Evans, 4th Cavalry," the officer said with a crisp salute. "We received a telegram from a Mrs. Mary Hartwell, forwarded by the Territorial Marshal's office in Denver. Said you might be in a spot of trouble." Samuel turned to look at Mary, who was leaning against the doorframe, her face smudged with soot, her knuckles white as she gripped the shotgun. A slow, triumphant smile spread across her face. "I sent it 3 days ago," she said, her voice hoarse, "from the next town over. I slipped out while you were distracting Jenkins. I didn't know if it would get there in time." She had never told him. She had carried that secret, that hope, all by herself. In the middle of the yard, the cavalry had rounded up the remaining men, including a wounded Buck Wheeler. But 2 figures were missing. Jeremiah Cobb and Pete Jenkins were gone. They had vanished into the storm. But as the lieutenant slapped cuffs on Wheeler, a new chilling piece of the puzzle fell into place. Where's the little girl? Wheeler snarled at Samuel, spitting blood onto the muddy ground. The one with the doll? Samuel's blood ran cold. He and Mary exchanged a look of pure horror. They had been so focused on the fight, on the house, they had forgotten. The cellar! Mary screamed. They raced to the kitchen, threw open the trap door, and found a scene of devastation. The bar had been broken from the outside, a second hidden entrance they never knew existed. The twins and Rebecca were huddled in a corner, terrified but unharmed. But Emma was gone, and so was her rag doll. The realization hit Samuel and Mary with the force of a physical blow. While they had been fighting for their lives in the house, Cobb and Jenkins had used the chaos as cover to get what they truly wanted. They hadn't just fled, they had taken Emma, and with her, the real ledger. The fight wasn't over. It had just entered a new, more horrifying stage. Rebecca's voice was a choked whisper. They came in the back, through the old root cellar door. We didn't even hear them until it was too late. Mr. Jenkins. He grabbed Emma. He told her he just wanted to see her doll. The kindly old man, the trusted friend. He had used a child's trust to steal their only weapon and their youngest family member. The cruelty of it was bottomless. Lieutenant Evans of the cavalry was grim-faced. They can't have gotten far in this storm. They'll have a fresh horse, but they'll be slowed down by the child. They're likely heading for the border. We'll track them. But Samuel knew this wasn't a military matter anymore. This was personal. With all due respect, Lieutenant, Samuel said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. This is my daughter. I'm going after them. There was no argument. The officer saw the look in Samuel's eyes. He saw a man who had been pushed past his limit, a father who would tear the world apart to get his child back. I can't officially sanction it, Evans said, but I can't stop you either. And your horse looks like it could use a rest. He gestured to one of his troopers. Give Mr. Morrison your mount. It's fresh. And take this. He handed Samuel a Colt Peacemaker, fully loaded. You'll move faster alone. Mary grabbed his arm, her eyes pleading. Samuel, don't. It's a suicide mission. It's the only mission that matters, he said, his gaze locked with hers. He saw the terror in her eyes, but underneath it, he saw understanding. She knew he had to do this. He was no longer just Samuel Morrison, the grieving rancher. He was a husband and a father, and his family was under attack. He kissed her, a hard, desperate kiss filled with fear and promise. I'll bring her home, Mary, I swear it. He mounted the cavalry horse, a powerful animal that felt alive beneath him. He looked down at the faces of his family. Mary, her strength a beacon in the terrifying dawn. Rebecca, trying to be brave for her brothers. The twins, their eyes wide with a fear that mirrored his own. This was what he was fighting for. He gave the horse its head, and it leaped forward, carrying him into the rain-soaked darkness in pursuit of two monsters. The tracks were easy to follow in the soft mud. Two horses, one riding heavy, Cobb and Jenkins. He pushed the horse harder, the wind and rain whipping at his face. He was fueled by a rage so pure and white-hot it burned away his fear. He wasn't thinking. He was hunting. He caught up to them 10 miles from the ranch, in a narrow rock-strewn canyon where the storm had turned a dry creek bed into a raging torrent. They had been forced to slow down, to navigate the treacherous terrain. He saw them ahead, two figures on horseback. The smaller figure, Jenkins, was holding a small, struggling bundle in his arms. Emma. Samuel didn't shout. He didn't warn them. He drew the Colt, aimed, and fired. The shot echoed through the canyon, and Jenkins' horse screamed and went down. Jenkins was thrown clear, but he lost his grip on Emma, who tumbled into the muddy brush at the side of the creek. Cobb wheeled his horse around, his face a mask of fury in the dim light. He drew his own pistol and fired, the bullet whining past Samuel's ear. Samuel dove from his horse, using a large boulder for cover as a gunfight erupted in the heart of the canyon. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks, the sound deafening. He could hear Emma crying, a terrified, heartbreaking sound that tore at his soul. He had to end this. Now. He waited for a lull in Cobb's firing, then peeked around the boulder. Cobb was reloading. In that split second, Samuel saw his chance. But he wasn't looking at Cobb. He was looking at Jenkins, who was scrambling toward Emma, the ledger now visible in his hand. "The book, Cobb! Get the book!" Jenkins shrieked, his voice thin with panic. In that moment of distraction, Samuel moved. He broke cover, not firing, but running. He sprinted toward the spot where Emma had fallen, zigzagging to make himself a harder target. A bullet tore through his sleeve. Another kicked up mud at his feet. He ignored them. He scooped Emma into his arms, her small body trembling violently. "It's okay, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice choked. "Daddy's here." He turned, shielding her with his body, and fired the Colt at Jenkins. The shot went wide, but it was enough to make the old man stumble back in terror. Cobb, seeing his prize about to be taken from him, spurred his horse forward, raising his pistol to fire at point-blank range. But from behind Samuel, another gunshot rang out. A rifle shot, loud and true. Cobb's eyes went wide with shock. A dark red stain blossomed on his chest. He swayed in the saddle for a moment, a look of disbelief on his face before toppling sideways into the raging creek. The current caught him immediately, pulling his body downstream into the darkness. Samuel spun around, his heart in his throat. Standing on the ridge above the canyon, silhouetted against the stormy sky, was Mary. She held Samuel's Winchester rifle, smoke curling from the barrel. She hadn't waited at the ranch. She had followed him. She had saved him. Pete Jenkins stood frozen, his face a mess of terror and defeat. He dropped the ledger into the mud and raised his hands in surrender. It was over. Samuel held Emma tight, burying his face in her hair, his body shaking with a relief so profound it felt like pain. Mary scrambled down the slick rocks to join them, wrapping her arms around both of them. They stood there for a long moment, a family reunited in the mud and the rain, the storm finally beginning to break around them. The nightmare was over. But as the first rays of dawn pierced through the clouds, Samuel looked at the ledger lying in the mud, then at the body of Jeremiah Cobb, being swept away by the current, and he knew that while their battle was won, the story of what had happened in this canyon and on that ranch was just beginning. It was a story that would change the Wyoming territory forever. The ride back to the ranch was a strange mix of exhaustion and triumph. Samuel rode with Emma held securely in front of him, her small head resting against his chest, fast asleep. Mary rode alongside, the Winchester resting across her lap, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon, ever watchful. The cavalry had secured the ranch, and Sheriff Bradley, his head bandaged, was taking statements. The capture of Cobb's men and the death of their leader sent a shockwave through the territory. The reign of terror was over. The ledger, muddy but intact, was handed over to Lieutenant Evans. It was even more damning than they had realized. It contained names, dates, and figures that implicated not just Cobb, but a dozen other prominent men across the territory in land fraud, extortion, and murder. Pete Jenkins, broken and weeping, confessed to everything, his testimony corroborating every word in Thomas Hartwell's meticulous records. The story of the Morrison family, as they were now known, became the stuff of legend. The story of the grieving rancher who bought a family at auction, the courageous widow who held the secrets of a criminal empire, and the community that finally rose up against a tyrant. It was a story of redemption, not just for Samuel and Mary, but for the whole town of Cheyenne. In the months that followed, life on the ranch transformed. With Cobb's empire dismantled, the railroad contract that Thomas Hartwell had been working on was suddenly viable. Using Mary's business acumen and Rebecca's sharp mind for numbers, Samuel formed a partnership with the other ranchers Cobb had been squeezing. Together, they fulfilled the contract, bringing a level of prosperity to the region that no one had thought possible. The money from the community that had been used to buy the family was paid back, with interest. The ranch flourished. The new barn, rebuilt with the help of grateful neighbors, stood as a proud symbol of their shared victory. The house was repaired and expanded. The fields were green, the cattle were healthy, and the laughter of children once again filled the rooms. But the biggest change was not in the land or the finances. It was in the hearts of the people who lived there. The awkward arrangement born of desperation had blossomed into a real family. Samuel, who had been drowning in grief, found a new purpose, a new love that healed the broken parts of his soul. Mary, who had lost everything, found a safe harbor and a partner who cherished her strength and intelligence. The children who had faced a terrifying and uncertain future finally had a home and a father who would move heaven and earth to protect them. One crisp October morning, with the aspen trees turning to gold on the hillsides, the entire town of Cheyenne gathered at the small community church. Samuel stood at the altar, no longer the haunted man from the auction, but a man filled with quiet joy. The twins, Joshua and Jacob, stood beside him as his groomsmen. He watched as Rebecca, now a confident young woman with plans to become a teacher herself, walked down the aisle as the maid of honor. He watched as little Emma, in a dress the color of sunshine, scattered petals from a basket, her rag doll tucked safely under her other arm. And then he watched as Mary walked toward him, her eyes shining, her smile a promise of all the good years to come. They weren't a family born of blood, but of choice. A choice made in a dusty courthouse square, a choice forged in fire and fear, and a choice sealed with love and commitment. They had saved each other, and in doing so, they had saved their community. They had proven that even in the harshest landscapes, in the darkest of times, the most powerful force in the world is not greed or power, but the simple, extraordinary courage of a family that refuses to be broken. What started with a desperate bid at a courthouse auction became a story of love, courage, and justice that echoed across the Wild West. Samuel and Mary Morrison, along with their 5 children, built a life and a legacy on that Wyoming ranch, proving that a family is not just something you are born into, but something you can build, something you can choose, and something worth fighting for. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next strange and incredible tale. Thank you for watching.